very much for that wonderful introduction. I've been blessed by my partnership with Kathleen and Pam Goodman and all for 25 years, and the terrific team that we've put together at Beacon Communities. The room is filled with people who have been important to my career, and if I spent time thanking them all, I would use up my limited amount of time. But I do have to single out a couple of people for special attention. You never forget your first client when you're a lawyer. And my first client was Arthur Ewing and Bob Cardman, and Arthur is here tonight. It was really off of, I'd come out of the government, and you needed to be trained by your clients. And Arthur and Bob did my training. And also my good friend, John Keith. John knows more about philosophy and life and human behavior than any philosopher or psychiatrist. And in the latter care, I have enough experience to know that it's absolutely true. They're really two terrific people. And the Patrick administration led by Tina has just been wonderful to our industry. I need to thank Linda Mooney, who's been my special assistant for a number of years now, and who's in charge of keeping me sane. And I want to thank Bank of America for hosting NH&RA and for its commitment to community development and to our own companies. Kathleen touched on my sense of optimism and my mountain climbers' focus on reaching a goal. It's easy to be dour and depressed and pessimistic, particularly in times of the middle of an economic downturn, a lunatic political cycle, and the very troubling income gap that's growing between the rich and the rest of the country. But I can continue to fight because I believe that we, and I include all of us in this room, have made a difference in the lives of the families and the elderly who need the housing we have had a hand in producing and managing. It's human nature to focus on the obstacles, and somewhat like political conservatives, we always have a belief that somehow it was easier to do a deal before, and now it's very hard. It was easier to get money before, but now it's very hard. But I actually have to look at, as Kathleen said, I have to look at the glass and see what we've accomplished. Through a quick look at some of the things that I've had a hand in my own career, I'd like us to remind us all of what we have accomplished. I grew up in the 50s in Chicago, where the city had actually done this magical act of tearing down private slums and replacing them with public slums called public housing. In college, I was more directly exposed to the debacle of urban public housing high-rises during a stint as a substitute teacher in the Pruitt-Igoe neighborhood of St. Louis. This is the era of the Great Society, and I had a vision that this was not the best the country could do to house its more needy families. For the last 40 years, I've had the amazing opportunity to test out the premise that we could do better. While my involvement started with a vision, my role has been more of a craftsperson, helping to fulfill the vision of some true visionaries. The opportunity for me started in 1974, working as a legal service attorney at the Mass Law Reform Institute. I had the opportunity to represent the American Park Tenants Association, led by Eleanor and Dan Wessel, and Marty Jones is here. I think, Marty, you were involved at that time? I don't remember if you were there. And Eleanor and Dan had this crazy idea, absolutely crazy idea, that they wanted to tear down this public housing development and replace it with a new mixed income mass housing development. People thought that they were insane. It just didn't happen. I also had the opportunity, though, to help them form a partnership with Joe Corcoran and Joe Mullins and Gary Jennison, who had the equally goofy idea that a private developer could do this in partnership with the residents. The conversion of America Park to Kings Lynn, followed up a decade later by the conversion of Columbia Point into Harbor Point, which I had an opportunity to structure when I was at the BHA, led to the realization that we could do better with our public housing and to the creation of the Hope 6 program. The reform of public housing was not just a story of building better buildings. It's the story of institutional change. I had the opportunity to work with Harry Spence to reform the Cambridge Housing Authority during the mid-70s. Harry was committed to improving the management of our urban institutions when others were declaring our cities as dead. My father was aghast. They had sent me to law school to end up doing eviction work for a public housing agency. He wanted his money back. No refund policy. But during Secretary Bielecki's presentation, we talked about the strength of the Cambridge and Boston housing markets. But for those of you who weren't there, it's hard to believe that in the mid-70s, Cambridge was a beleaguered city. Harvard and MIT had essentially barricaded themselves off from the rest of the city. The Housing Authority had spent its entire year's budget in 6 months. It was on the verge of being placed in receivership by the state. When we got there, we found that there was not a single element of the authority that was not corrupt. And the corruption was not subtle or creative. On one of my first days at the Housing Authority, I took a call from a local attorney who informed me that he represented a resident who had a fire in her apartment. He asked me how I wanted to handle it. As a former legal service attorney, fire claims were not an area of my special expertise. But I figured, well, let the resident file a claim and I'd send it to the insurance company. He said no. And he repeated, how did I want to handle it? When I honestly confessed that I didn't understand the question, he said the deal with the former general counsel was the claim would be inflated, and the guys at the authority would get 58%, and he wanted to know whether this was still going to be the deal with the new administration. Perfectly upfront. When I said no, he said, fine, how do you want to handle it? And we went on. But everything at the authority was that way. In 1980, the administration of the BHA was so incompetent and corrupt that Judge Garrity, another man of great vision, put the authority in receivership. And he had another opportunity to work with Harry to establish the receivership's planning and legal department. 30 years later, under the guidance of Mayor Menino, the BHA is in the hands of a first-rate administration and committed to sound management practices and rebuilding its portfolio. A number of people who worked at the BHA during the receivership went on to lead the national task force that created the 6 program and to lead the battle for reform in authorities around the country. So while much remains to be done, we've taken public housing from a national disgrace to being seen by certain critical political leaders as an important resource that can be competently managed and that these valuable sites must be preserved for affordable housing. As in public housing, there's been amazing progress in the development of privately owned affordable housing, whether created by for-profit or not-for-profit organizations. I think that the deals that have been presented at NH&RA today are examples of what we can do now in affordable housing. But after an initial wave of private affordable housing developments that were in some respects worse than public housing, men envisioned a man that Jerry knows well, but most people here don't know, Bill White, who founded Mass Housing, and Marvin Siffinger, who many of you do know, started to demand that the private sector develop well-located, well-designed, and professionally managed affordable housing. And Jerry and Ed Fish were the leaders in making Mass Housing adhere to those types of standards. Both during my tenure at General Counsel of Mass Housing and as an attorney representing private developers at Vince Levin, I saw a real commitment by developers, architects, and agencies to provide housing that enhanced the lives of those in need. Working with Arthur Yulian and Bob Cardman and Arthur Wynn and John Keith, we permitted and built truly mixed-income housing in Lexington, Burlington, Andover, and Canton, and this was all before the REITs came to town. We could do it locally. Nothing better personifies what we've accomplished than one of the last developments that Ed Fish did in his remarkable life, in the metropolitan that Matt referred to in Boston's Chinatown. When you think about it, a high-rise, a partnership with the community, a great urban location, mixed income, mixed tenure, great design, and if I know Ed, he also probably made a lot of money. I have witnessed what can be accomplished when people of good faith and common commitment work together. At Beacon Communities, we were able to take the doubly envisioned idea of Harry Spence when he was commissioner of DSS and Judy Cockerton to create Treehouse at East Hampton, a community serving families engaged with adopted and foster children with the support of seniors helping out and being helped out. Treehouse is only possible because of the leadership of the governor's office, the bravery of the local mayor, the coordination of a myriad of organizations, Bank of America, DHED, CDAC, DSS, and Mass Housing. It took a community to build the community. I've also had the opportunity to lead the effort to preserve affordable housing. Kathleen and I worked on drafting the initial local legislation and structured some of the first preservation transactions that were done in the country here for Corcoran, John Corcoran, in the Beaver transactions and Castle Square with Arthur Wynn. So we've accomplished a lot more than we want to give ourselves credit for sometimes. And looking ahead, there's a temptation to focus on the limited resources. I was recently at an event in which one of our state senators, Senator Jim Timilty, said, even when there is money, there isn't money. So I think we need to focus not on the money, but on the task, and to do what we do with the resources that are available. And I think we need to focus on 4 things. We must preserve and enhance our existing portfolio of public and private affordable housing. Financially impossible to replicate the inventory. At Beacon Communities, we'd say depreciation is not just an accountant's idea to create tax losses. These buildings really do depreciate. These developments are 30 and 40 years old. They need to be rebuilt. We must enhance the social services to fit the needs of the current residents. I'm very supportive of HUD's efforts to marry an element of mobility to our project-based subsidy programs. The time has come that a resident should not have to choose between a new job or better schools and losing invaluable financial support. Similarly, we must continue to push to develop affordable housing in our thriving suburban areas where there are great schools and new jobs being created. I'm interested in the recent decision of the Texas Supreme Court suggesting that allocating agencies need to more seriously take into account fair housing issues in their allocation process. In Massachusetts, this means defeating the anti-40B referendum and ultimately creating a zoning regime that requires communities to provide for a diverse housing stock, as Secretary Bielecki suggested. Lastly, we need to focus our resources on developing housing that serves our special needs populations, such as Treehouse, who the unassisted private market will never reach. While we've achieved in these efforts, through the efforts of all of you in this room, I have no doubt that in the future we will continue to make progress towards our ultimate goal of making quality, affordable housing available to anyone in our society. Thank you very much for the opportunity.